Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larry Schwartz, Secretary to Governor Cuomo. To my far right is Ben Lawsky, the Superintendent for the Department of Financial Services, and to my immediate right, of course, is Governor Andrew Cuomo. Before we begin, I just want to make a few announcements. This weekend, the National Guard delivered thousands of packets of donated food, water, and home goods to the affected areas of Staten Island, the Rockaways, Nassau, and Suffolk counties. The governor joined the Guard and volunteers to make these deliveries to impacted communities, and the donations were made in response to the governor's call for corporations to donate to the victims of Hurricane Sandy. Also, specifically, Walmart and Home Depot supplied thousands of food and household items that range from things like granola bars, water, Gatorade, cereal, bleach, paper towels, garbage bags to help with the cleanup, and many more items. In addition, dozens of other major corporations have responded to the governor's call for help to provide food, water, and other supplies, and drops will continue throughout the region as long as their need remains. And with that update, I'd like to hand it over to Governor Cuomo.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Larry Schwartz for the good work he's been doing. We're joined by the superintendent of the Department of Financial Services, Ben Lawsky. I'd like to thank him for his good work. We'll give you a quick update and then a couple of points that I'd like to make, and then whatever questions you have. First, to follow up on the point that Mr. Schwartz made about this weekend and the donations. We are so eclipsed by the difficulties of the moment that there's another story, there's another situation that's going on that is also worth noting, and it came home this weekend. The number of volunteers, the number of people who are just showing up, who want to help, that are doing really extraordinary things, is amazing. When you're out there in these situations, the destruction is so overwhelming that it's hard to appreciate. But in the midst of all of the chaos and the destruction are really these individual stories of generosity and kindness and community and caring that are really, really heartwarming. And that's something that I had the pleasure of experiencing this weekend. Larry was talking about the corporations who've helped. But I mean, there are people who come from all over the state. They bring food, they bring dishes they've prepared, they bring clothing. They come just to volunteer, people from all over the country. It really is extraordinary. On gasoline, as most people have seen, the gasoline situation is different in different parts of the region. There is no one situation. When gas rationing was done, the odd-even system was put in place. It's synchronized between New York City, Nassau, and Suffolk. Westchester, Rockland, which had the same basic supply issue, never had the long lines because they never had the panic or the anxiety of the long lines. Long lines beget long lines, as strange a phenomenon as that seems. But reports are that the lines are abating. And as the anxiety and the panic reduces, the lines will abate. What was important to us and what is important is that we stay synchronized, that there has to be, I believe, there should be one system for Nassau, Suffolk, and New York City. We don't want people shopping across the border. New York City is one system. They run to Nassau, Nassau, they run to Suffolk, etc. But it is getting better. Power, the situation has greatly improved. Again, the numbers are misleading. We're up to about 98-99% of the people have their power back. If you are in the 1% that doesn't have their power back, the 98-99 doesn't mean anything with you and for you. And until we have all the power back, the numbers are meaningless. But there is a shift that is happening that people have to be aware of. 98 to 99% of the people have their power back. There are people who are still waiting for power. There are people who will say, well, they won't tell me when I get my power back. Power company won't tell me if I'm going to get it before Christmas. By Thanksgiving, they won't tell me. There is a little confusion that people have to understand. There are some people who are not going to get their power back because it is not a power issue any longer. It is a housing issue. And 99% of the people who can have their power back do. If you don't have your power back, it probably means power can't be restored to your home at this time. And those numbers are roughly in Nassau County 17,000, Suffolk only several hundred, the Rockaways 29,000, Brooklyn 12,000. These are homes in the heavily impacted, flooded areas that have in most cases been inspected or reviewed, and the decision has been made that power can't be turned on. So we are at a point now where the situation is going to shift from a power issue, restoration of power issue, if you will, to a housing issue. And people are literally going to be feeling that today, tomorrow. They started over the weekend when they realized that it wasn't going to be any minute that the power was going to come back. The power company is not going to turn on the power until the house is restored. This week, we're moving into a housing program response priority mission. When it comes to housing, if the power company isn't going to turn on power in your home, the first question is, where are you going to shelter yourself? It will be getting colder. It could take a number of weeks depending on the damage that is done to the home. The first question becomes a question of shelter. FEMA has two types of sheltering program, what they call a short-term sheltering program and a long-term sheltering program. If your house only needs light repairs and it's a matter of days, there's a FEMA program that can put you up in a hotel or a motel for 2 weeks. They can even renew the 2 weeks. But if you have a 2-week situation, that's one program. If it's going to be a longer-term reconstruction program, FEMA has a program that goes up to 18 months where you basically rent an apartment, you rent a home, and they will pay the rental assistance during the pendency of the reconstruction of your home. FEMA has very aggressive reconstruction programs up to about $31,000, $31,900 for reconstruction. New York City, Nassau County, Suffolk County are starting basically contractor facilitation programs where the city and the counties working with FEMA will actually dispatch contractors to your home. But it's important that people realize at one point it does shift. With tens of thousands of people, the reality that the lights are not coming on tomorrow morning. They're not coming on until the house is restored. And let's start to work on that issue, the sheltering and the housing repair reconstruction issue. We can help, the state's role can help to this extent. FEMA generally gets involved and reimburses if you don't have private flood insurance or if you don't have private insurance that can cover the loss. The state regulates the insurance industry, and the insurance industry can often be slow in response, and obviously time matters here. So DFS, Department of Financial Services, Superintendent Losky, is going to start a 24-hour service, 7 days a week, where people can call, explain their problem to a real person, not to a tape recorder, not to a hit the touch tone button madness. You talk to a real person, explain your situation, explain your policy, explain your company, and they will have a person contact your insurance company on your behalf to facilitate that. We expect a large volume, and that's why the 24 hours, 7 days a week, which is fine because Ben doesn't need much sleep anyway. The phone number to call Ben, 1-800-339-1759. And again, that'll be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you have private insurance, check that first because FEMA will not reimburse if the person has private insurance. So you're going to need to know that information anyway. Second, there is something called a supplemental appropriation. Supplemental appropriation is when the federal government appropriates money for a state, for a region, in response to a disaster. And my firm position is that New York needs a supplemental appropriation from the federal government to help us rebuild from Hurricane Sandy. We've been talking for the past couple of weeks about FEMA and FEMA reimbursement. FEMA reimburses for emergency expenses, basically out-of-pocket expenses. There's then an issue of how much they reimburse. 75-25, 75% paid by the Fed, 25 by the state and local. I've asked for 100% reimbursement. There's also, some people are suggesting a 90-10 ratio of reimbursement. But that is only for reimbursement of out-of-pocket emergency expenses by the state and the local government. Police department costs, sheltering costs, etc. The damage here is much more severe than just the out-of-pocket expense. We have suffered what we estimate to be about a $30 billion economic loss. Just reimbursing the out-of-pocket expenses does not come close to making up to the economic damage that has been done to this state and this region. And with much practice, the federal government has acknowledged that need in the past, and the Congress has done a special appropriation. Hurricane Katrina is obviously probably the most popular and most noted one. But they've done hurricanes, they've done floods, literally many, many, many times that the Congress has appropriated an additional sum to help that region rebuild from the economic loss. And I think it's inarguable, but that on the merits and the devastation that has been done in New York, that we're going to require a supplemental appropriation to really get this economy up and running again. The supplemental appropriation would be to help rebuild the economy for basic categories, to rebuild the infrastructure. Second, housing. Third, to help local government with public buildings and public reconstruction. And fourth, small business. We've talked a lot about the housing needs. There has been a devastating impact on small business. And many of the federal programs only offer small businesses low-interest loans, which is the last thing they need because they're not in a position to take on another loan. So the small business assistance, I think, is very important. We estimate about $30 billion in loss, and I think a fair special appropriation for this state would be about $30 billion. This is an economy that is important not just to the state, this is an economy that is important to the country. And this was cataclysmic for New York. And I think it's a wise investment for the federal government to help us build this economy back. The sooner we get the New York economy running, the better for this state and this nation. Questions?
Governor, a few questions for you regarding some of the numbers that you broke down. We talked a lot in the wake of Sandy about LIPA. At my last check, there's about 70,000 customers, LIPA customers, without power. Are you saying that most of their issues at this point are housing related and not related to the power company itself?
We'll get you the county by county breakdown on the numbers. You're going to be in every region of the state, in the metropolitan area affected, in the range of 98 to 99% of the people have their power on. That means either you are in the 1% who can have power restored and don't, or you're a house that has been inspected and the utility company is saying they can't turn on your power. It's an important distinction because people need to know. See, many people are in the house waiting to have their lights turned on. And they think any minute somebody's going to flick a switch and they're going to have lights turned on. When you get up to 98, 99%, that is still possible, but it is not probable. What is most probable is they are in a home that has been inspected or reviewed, and they can't power the home. Meaning what? Meaning the home has been damaged significantly, and there's damage to the home that they're afraid that if they power the electric system, you could do more harm than good. You could start a fire, there could be an explosion, maybe there's a gas line that's open, and then you turn on the power system and there's a spark. There was salt water damage to the electrical circuits, which is problematic. So it's important for people to understand this, because if you're just waiting for the power company to turn it on, but that's not really the problem, and the problem is you're going to have to get that repair made first, you need to know that, and you need to know that quickly.
As a follow-up question to that, there's been significant outrage, as you've seen, against LIPA. As governor of New York, you were the head of that public authority. Specifically, I understand there are 6 Board of Trustees positions that have not been filled. There's been no president for the past 2 years. What's your answer to those problems? Do you take responsibility for what's been happening and what hasn't been happening at LIPA?
Well, LIPA is not the provider of power. National Grid is the provider of power, right? LIPA has basically been an intergovernmental political organization for most of its time. The provider there is National Grid, the way the provider is Con Edison, the way the provider is PSE&G. These are the providers, the utilities that are the providers. Now, they are regulated by the state of New York, primarily by the Public Service Commission, which determines the rate of reimbursements, sets rates, etc. But they are long-standing, basically monopolistic bureaucracies. And I have said from day one, they are going to be held accountable. They're going to be held accountable by me as governor of this state on behalf of the people of the state. Because I think, and I understand the immensity of the storm, I really, really do. And I want to be fair and reasonable with the utility companies, because they'll say, well, you just don't understand, Governor. You don't understand how many tree limbs were down and how big the devastation. I understand. But I think they were not prepared. I think they were non-communicative in their response. I think the non-communicativeness actually exacerbated the situation. People understood that they went through a storm. New Yorkers are understanding people. But just tell me the facts. Tell me when. Tell me how. Give me an idea. The non-communication. Con Edison went through a situation in Astoria several years back. Same problem, lack of communication. People just didn't know. Is it tomorrow morning? Is it tomorrow night? Should I leave? Should I take my kids? So I have said to the people of this state, they will be held accountable. I want to get...
Have been held accountable previous, the fact that their Board of Trustees positions haven't been filled, there hasn't been a president. Why was nothing done in the months prior, the years prior? These are systems that go back literally decades. Literally decades. Especially in the case of Con Edison. And it is a system that doesn't work for this type of emergency crisis reaction. It doesn't. It's a system from a different time and a different place. We're going to have this question, I think, in many more areas, by the way. But their preparation, their responsiveness, the communication, the coordination. But do you take any responsibility for that as the head overseer?
I am, as the head overseer, when we get stabilized, I'm going to do a thorough review/investigation, and a very serious one, and they will be held accountable for past performance. And then we also have to get smart about this, and we have to make sure that we're prepared for when this happens again, because I believe this will happen again. And I think anyone who says, well, this was a once in a lifetime, this is once every 100 years, that is denial. And I think it's a serious mistake, and I'm not going to govern this way. So accountable for the past, yes. Accountable for the past performance, yes. Also making the kinds of modifications we need for the future. So when this happens again, we're ready, and we did preparation so the impact isn't as bad, and we know how to respond.
There's
Mark, you said last week that you would consider bringing in outside utility companies, that you would not be beholden to those that are here now, that you could bring them in from other states. Is any further consideration to get into that?
Well, first, we have brought in utility companies just during this storm, Marvin. We have utility companies, if you drive around, especially to the outer boroughs, Westchester and Nassau, Suffolk, you have utility companies from all across the country that are here. You have literally trucks from California, Arizona, Tennessee, Arkansas. I've talked to crews. It's amazing how many crews we brought in. But yes, going forward, I would say there is nothing off the table. The system doesn't work. It doesn't work. Fix it. There is nothing off the table. Let's get a group of talented people who bring a clean piece of paper, review the situation, and design a new system.
Governor, do you think LIPA would have performed differently if it had a fully stocked board with some of the
Nope.
points?
I don't think they haven't performed a meaningful function, in my opinion, for decades. You know, they are not a functioning, they don't provide the power. National Grid provides the power. They are a holding company, which was created initially to hold debt from the Shoreham nuclear plant, believe it or not. And since then, they've basically been a political, intergovernmental organization. They don't serve a, National Grid runs the system.
Zach and Tom. Zach and Tom.
Following up on your remarks just now, that's a two-part question. Going forward, you see not all one swoop, but the infrastructure being changed from above ground in many areas to below ground. And are you indicating that you think LIPA is an anachronism?
I don't know if we are prepared to move all the wires underground. If you were designing a new system, if you could go back and do it from scratch, you would put the wires under the ground. There's no doubt. It's very expensive. It's very time-consuming. It would be an investment of billions and billions of dollars. It is a major problem, especially Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, because you have tremendous number of trees, and it gets very simple. The wind blows, the tree falls, hits the wire, and the wire's down. I have neighbors of mine in Westchester still don't have power, and the trees are a tangled mess with the wires right in front of their home. So it's a very simple situation to understand. Well, we should bury all the wires. Yes, in a perfect world, we would go back and bury all the wires. Billions and billions of dollars. On the structure of the utilities going forward, as I said before, I think I would ask put together a group, is my plan, do an investigation and review, and have a blank piece of paper, and design the system that they think should be designed. Period. And leave it that open-ended. Study the other states, see what they're doing, and design the best, copy the best, model the best for the state. I'm not wed to any of the utilities, any of the jurisdictions, obviously. And I don't think, by the way, I don't think the ratepayers are. I've never heard a consumer say to me, don't change, I'll only pay Con Edison.
Governor, we learned in September that Con Edison might be doing the Public Service Commission. I believe this month asking for payback. Should they reconsider that?
Zach, I think it adds insult to injury for Con Edison or any of these utility companies to be asking for a rate increase in the midst of this. It's a hollow apology from Con Edison when the next word out of their mouth is, I want a rate increase. If I represent I'm on the other side of the table, right? I represent the ratepayers. I think the utility should be talking about rebating to the ratepayer. I didn't have power for 2 weeks. Why doesn't the utility rebate to me? Right? I've been paying my bill all this time. I haven't had power. I lost food. I lost time. I had to buy a generator. I had to stay out of work. Why aren't they rebating to me? I think their attitude is exactly reverse.
Governor, are there any other states or municipal utility models that you think work?
We're looking at a few now, but I would rather bring in let's get past this, and I want the utilities to focus on finishing. And remember, finishing, we're going to 2 phases. This is not going to be finished 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. This is going to be months and months. So, calibrate your internal clock so we don't have a conversation in 2 weeks. Well, I thought it was supposed to be done. It's not going to be done in 2 weeks. It's not going to be done in 2 months. This is rebuilding communities. But let them focus short-term on getting the power back. Then I want to conduct a formal, independent review/investigation. 2 questions. What happened in this storm? Look at the preparations. Look at the performance. Look at the performance as guided by past performance from other storms. As I said, Con Edison. You can go back and look at the discussion around the Astoria, Long Island City situation. It's the same conversation. Same conversation. Report. No, that's good.
Would you be doing the same thing with the gas situation?
Yes, for a different reason. The gasoline situation was frankly, in some ways, a case of first impression. You can go back with Con Edison, read the Astoria, Long Island City situation, and you'll see parallels. The fuel situation was markedly different. Fuel situation is one of the systems that makes us incredibly vulnerable. And you wouldn't think about it. All this delay, all this anxiety, all the wait at the pumps comes from about 2 days of loss of supply. We lost about 2 days in the fuel delivery system. And this chaos was created by a 2-day loss of supply. What would a 2-week loss of supply look like? You paralyze the whole region. And it's amazing how vulnerable the system is. How few pipelines come in, how vulnerable the pipelines need electricity. Pipelines can't operate if there's a storm because the Coast Guard closed the harbor, so the tanker couldn't come in. We lost power. Pump that pumps the fuel through the pipeline turns off. One pipeline cracks because a tree falls on it and hits it. And it's amazing how vulnerable you are. So you get the power back. We talk about power. Fuel is another situation, which is basically just like that.
Laura?
Governor, how do you plan to get Congress to agree to give you that much money? Will you physically head to Washington? And have you spoken with Governor Christie about going down there? And how are you going to make it like getting blood from the stone? How are you going to get it?
Laura, if I went to Washington now, what story would you write? Look, I think on the merits, this is a very clear case for the state of New York. When you look at the past disasters and the past supplementals that have been passed for other parts of the country, I think the numbers speak for themselves. I think the equity and the fairness is inarguable in this case. We have a very strong congressional delegation. We're talking to them now and talking about the need and what the potential plan would look like. My guess is, Laura, it would be a regional plan. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut had some damage. There were other states. They normally do the entire region that was affected. So that's what this supplemental would be for the region, the entire region that was affected by Sandy.
The $30 billion is just for New York?
Just for New York. They would then add what they think is necessary for the other states. They'd put it all together, and that would be the supplemental. But when you look, we're going to hand out some of the other supplementals that have been done. This is quite common, and it has been done in areas that were not nearly as affected as New York.
Guys, one more question. Governor, we've heard a little bit about some union issues involving LIFO with linemen perhaps not working through some other states that are not in the U.S. Have you heard of any of that? And do you have to?
I have not, Zach. You have crews. You have, National Grid has about 200-300 linemen normally. You have something like 5,000 linemen, line people, whatever the appropriate term is. from all over the country, and I have not heard that.
Governor, getting people insurance money, whether it's FEMA or private insurance, that should help in finding housing. But you're talking about tens of thousands of people who may need a roof over their heads. Is there anything the state can do to physically help that process?
Well, it's a good question. The housing market, you have two issues, right? You have, let's call it shelter versus reconstruction. And the shelter can be two types. It can be a short-term hotel, motel, 2 weeks, or fair market rent up to 18 months. For a longer-term shelter, your house needs more serious reconstruction. FEMA will pay the fair market rent in that area. If the fair market rent, so sort of like I related to a Section 8 voucher that actually pays a market rate. The problem with the Section 8 voucher is they're set so low on the reimbursement rate, nobody will take them, or it tightens the market. But if you have a rental voucher that truly pays the fair market rent in that area, then I think, I'm cautiously optimistic, that the market will work. You know, if you can pay, you have the vacancy in the metropolitan area to find units. Mechanically, administratively, it's difficult. You know, how do I go look? Who's going to help me? My car was destroyed. How do I transport myself? How about my goods? But if the value of the subsidy is high enough, Chris, there is vacancy in the metropolitan area. Now, what happens to that vacancy rate once 10,000 people start looking? I don't know. And are we helpful, and can we be helpful in finding the units and making those connections? Yes, and we will. One of the issues we're working on today is FEMA has to set that rental value high enough where you really have the full expanse of the marketplace. On the other side, that's the shelter side. On the reconstruction side, first question from FEMA is, do you have private flood insurance? If you do, go to your private flood insurance, and that's the DFS service from the state. If you don't, FEMA's top reimbursement is basically $31,900. There are going to be many, many people who say, I can't rebuild my house for $31,900. By the way, $31,900 is a national number. We have a very expensive housing market in New York. You know, and $31,900 is one thing in other parts of this country. It's something else in this state. But so you'll have many people who the $31,900 does not cover their cost. What happens to them? They didn't have private insurance. They have the $31,900 from FEMA. We are going to be initiating a state program to supplement the FEMA grant to try to make up a cash shortfall on the reconstruction. And we're also exploring ways to supplement the FEMA money by purchases on the homeowner's behalf, if you will, where we would provide material for the reconstruction. But I believe on the housing side, Chris, that's going to be the problem. People who had significant damage, they didn't have private insurance, and $31,900 is not going to cover the loss. And $31,900 is for everything. Personal, household items, vehicle, I think is also in the $31,900. The rental value is deducted from the $31,900. If you have a long-term rental program, they deduct that from the $31,900. So, state could subsidize it, or if we get a supplemental appropriation, that money could also go to supplement it, because it will have to be supplemented for thousands of families. That I can tell you right now. Charitable funds we're raising could also possibly subsidize it. But that's going to be a tremendous need. I'm not so sure what the shelter need is going to be and what the market's reaction to these fair market payments is going to be.
One more, and then we gotta go. Marv, and then we gotta go.
You've been in discussion with FEMA. Have they indicated to you how much they're prepared to come forward with? You've asked for $30 billion. They're in a fiscal crisis. Their national flood program is $18 billion in debt, still paying off for Hurricane Katrina. How much do you expect at this point, without that supplement, will come to New York?
Good question, Marvin. Let's just separate two things. FEMA does reimbursement for the emergency expenses. Their normal statutory split on the emergency costs is 75%, 25%. Federal government pays 75% of the cost. Local government pays 25%. Split between the state and the locality by some formula to be worked out. To FEMA, I have said, I don't want 75, 25%. I want a 100% federal coverage rate. Okay? FEMA, that's a conversation we're having with FEMA. The supplemental appropriation doesn't go through FEMA. Supplemental appropriation says on top of the FEMA program, on top of what FEMA reimburses the state, on top of what FEMA pays to the individual homeowner, an additional payment to the state, a supplemental appropriation passed by Congress of $30 billion because the out-of-pocket doesn't really make me whole. Reimbursing me for my emergency expenses for the past 2 weeks doesn't make me whole. Reimbursing the homeowner just to rebuild the house doesn't make that homeowner whole, doesn't make the economy whole. The supplemental appropriation says, in this situation, the damage was so significant that there has been a long-term economic loss. And that's what the supplemental, which is passed by Congress, would be for. So it's not really going to be up to FEMA. It would have to be passed, it was Laura's point, it has to be passed by the Congress. And it would be passed for the Congress probably on a regional basis for all the states affected by Sandy.
Governor, about the rebuilding, you mentioned earlier that in reviewing this, there were some areas you were going to consider where to rebuild and areas where you're going to consider where not to rebuild. Have you identified any particular areas that you think it's better to not rebuild since these extreme weather patterns are going to become more common?
You know, I haven't, Ozzy, but look, you know, people, there are what they call buyout programs by FEMA. You have some people who are in areas where they have been flooded so many times in such a short period of time that they are basically saying, I don't want to rebuild. You know, I don't want to go through this again. And for those people, there is a federal buyout program that says the federal government will buy the house from you and leave the space, leave the lot vacant, basically. Because experience shows it's in a floodplain, it's in an area that is prone to be damaged, and it doesn't pay to rebuild because chances are it's going to happen again.
Governor, on the supplemental appropriation, how much of that would be for transit and transportation? Is the $3.5 billion being realized today accurate? And how would you arrive at that number?
We're talking about four buckets of funding: infrastructure, housing, local government, and small business. I don't really have a breakdown within those areas as to what it would be. We need to do more work. I can tell you the small business need is going to be profound, partially because I think the way the FEMA programs are structured, they're not meeting the need of small businesses. As I said before, they're offering a low-interest loan. These businesses don't want a low-interest loan. They don't want to take on more debt. They need somebody who can help them open up the doors again of the business, and they need a grant program, frankly. So I know that's going to be significant. The infrastructure category will be based on what do we want to do, you know, and to what extent do we want to do it now. I believe firmly that we should use this moment, learn from this moment, and the first lesson we can learn is the lesson of acknowledgement and to give up the denial that there is climate change. I don't want to start a whole political argument, but it is undeniable, but there is climate change. You can have a great political argument about what caused the climate change, and you're going to get all sorts of scientists arguing it's just a pattern in the weather, and it's historically repeating. You get all great scientists saying it's caused by human behavior. Whatever the cause, it is happening, right? We can either have this great debate in gridlock, or we can sort of acknowledge reality and say, we'll continue to argue about the cause. The effect is inarguable. It is happening. The ocean gets warmer, it changes the climate, extreme climate is causing problems all around the globe repeatedly, right? At one point, we've seen the movie. We've seen the movie. I've seen the movie, 22 months. I saw it with Hurricane Irene, I saw it with Storm Lee, I've seen it with Hurricane Sandy. I get it. I've seen the movie 3 times. Climate change is real. It's here. It's going to happen again. What do we do about it? And how do we harden our systems? How do we make sure this doesn't happen with the fuel system again? How do we make sure it doesn't happen with the cell phone system? You want to talk about chaos. Power goes out, and the cell phone system goes out. You want to talk about panic and anxiety. Forget a line at a pump. Watch 8 million people trying to get home to check on their kids with no power and no communication. That's chaos and anxiety. So how do we harden these systems? How do we have a first responder network that is really trained to do this, which our networks are not trained to do? This severity, and this frequency. These are all new questions for us. And we're going to have to think them through. Some are going to be long-term. Some will be controversial. But some, I think, are short-term and necessary and things you just need to do, you know. They go to, well, we're going to build barriers out in the ocean to stop. You know, that's fascinating, and I'd love to sit in on a few panels talking about that over months. But that's going to be a, you know, a long-term, fascinating topic to discuss. There are practical things, real things that we could do now that we know we have to do anyway. And that's what the supplemental appropriation could help us do. Okay, guys, thank you very much.